Everyone's asking if AI is in a bubble. We're spending 1.2% of GDP on data centers. But what people aren't talking about is the real story here. This is a story about brain power. We're witnessing the fastest explosion of intelligence in Earth's history, something closer to the rise of a new species rather than just a stock chart. There are 3 parts to understanding this puzzle. So we're going to start by really understanding if this is a bubble. Then we're going to look at what the bubble looks like on the ground, with actually building these new AI cities that we're starting to create. And finally, we're going to look at the new Moore's Law and how the rise of AI is similar to the rise of Homo sapiens 70,000 years ago. Okay, so one of the reasons you might think we're in a bubble is because 7 big companies, that they are more than 30% of the whole S&P 500. It's hard to know whether this is right or not. Maybe they're just really good companies and we should be giving them 30% of the weight of the whole S&P 500. Well, a good way to understand whether something is a bubble is to look at the PE ratio, the price to earnings ratio. And you can see that this is a graph of the PE ratio for the Mag 7 versus the rest of the S&P 500, aka the S&P 493. And you can see that this is kind of like a normal PE ratio for the rest of them, 20-ish, versus the PE ratio for the Mag 7 is something more like 40 or 50. And so the idea behind the PE ratio is that for one of these like schlub companies down here, so let's say they have a price of $1 billion, that's their market cap, that's their P, the earnings, then you'd say, okay, if the PE ratio is 20 for them, that would mean that their earnings are 1/20th of their price. And so for $1 billion company, that would mean their earnings are $50 million. And so this is a good way to kind of check with companies and be like, oh, okay, is this company undervalued? Wow, its PE ratio is only 10, so no one really wants this company, even though it has a really low price, but pretty good earnings for that price. Versus some of these, the Mag 7, 40 or 50 PE ratio. So for something like Nvidia, they're about $1 trillion. They're actually $4 trillion now, but at $1 trillion at a PE ratio of 40, they would have something like $25 billion of earnings. And so the reason why you'd have a strong PE ratio is because if you expect those earnings to go higher and higher and higher over time, and so it's worth it to pay this kind of increased inflated price now because you know that those earnings are going to soon catch up to their to the price. And so this chart kind of looks bad. It's like, oh man, a PE ratio of 40 for these Mag 7 companies, but is there anything useful actually coming out of AI? Should everybody be buying all these Nvidia chips? And maybe it's all going to come crashing down just like pets.com. And so what this graph shows is the PE ratios during the .com bust versus now. So now, 30 or 40, that's a high PE ratio, higher than, during a recession or whatever, but it's not as crazy as it was with like these 80 or 100 PE ratios way back in the day. So the .com boom and bust had a bubble for a variety of other reasons. They were going public. People were just getting access to them through these new digital platforms like Fidelity, E-Trade, whatever. And so it was a lot of retail investors getting access to stocks that had no actual earnings, but the people were just kind of aping into these new meme coins like pets.com. First, that had no real revenue versus now, yeah, some of the Mag 7 do have real revenue. But besides the Mag 7, you can ask whether these other companies like OpenAI and Anthropic should have the valuations they have. And so recently, there's some things that are likely overvalued here. Mira's new company, Ilya's new company, they're valued at like $10 to $30 billion, but with seemingly no revenue. So that's kind of a harder sell. But then for something like OpenAI and Anthropic, they're valued at 100 billion, 500 billion, but they have a lot more revenue. So let's check out their PE numbers. And so something like OpenAI, they did a $150 billion round recently, and they just did another $500 billion round with Altimeter both times, I believe. And so if you add up, so we can check the PE ratio for OpenAI, you say, okay, $12 billion of ARR total, across consumer subscriptions, business, API. So, let's call it $10 billion of ARR. And so if the price for that should be about at a 20 to 1 ratio, it should be $200 billion. And so it's easy to kind of talk yourself into OpenAI being valued at $500 billion because if it was in the public markets, if it wasn't part of the Mag 7, it should be valued at about $200 billion. And if it was part of the Mag 7, it could easily get up to, $500 billion. And that's especially true because both for the Mag 7 and for you could call this like the Mini 2 or whatever, that we expect lots of growth with them. So for OpenAI, the weekly active users is something like 700 million weekly active users. If that 3x's and their current ARPU, their average revenue per user, goes from $10 to $70 through ads and stuff like that, then you can easily imagine 3xing plus 7xing, 20xing annual revenue. So it's not just $12 billion, but something more like $100 billion. And then you start to get into true Mag 7 categories. And I think Anthropic is similar. $5 billion of revenue. They just did a $150 billion round maybe, or $150 billion tender offer. So you had a 20-to-1 P to E ratio, that'd be a $100 billion valuation. So yeah, I think it's kind of reasonable-ish, the amount that OpenAI and Anthropic are going for versus these ones that you're just betting on a team with no product for, $10 billion, $20 billion. Those seem like a harder sell to me. But let's go back to this. We're spending 1% of US GDP on infrastructure capex. So that's like, oh God, $20 trillion, $30 trillion of US GDP. So we're spending $300 billion per year on AI data centers. That's mostly Mag 7, the big four, Microsoft, Meta, Google, etc., spending tons of money building out these data centers. And the question is whether it's how bubbly that is. And I think the right frame on this is similar to telecoms and railroads, where yes, there's bubble-like tendencies, as with those $10 billion valuations with no product or no revenue. But more importantly, this builds out infrastructure. And so for railroads and telecom in the past, those built out railroad and telco infrastructure that we used for a long time. But I think the bigger story here is what the hell the $300 billion is actually going towards. To understand that, we're going to have to look at the second big idea here around AI cities. So what the heck is all this $300 billion going towards? Building out these data centers. And to understand what a data center is, I like to think of them, a single H100, a single one of these GPU chips as like a studio apartment. You have a little brain inside, either an H100 or a human brain. They're both going at roughly the same speed, 1 petaflop for each. And you're just adding new brain power to the world. And so if one H100 is a studio apartment, then 100,000 H100s is more like a new city of studio apartments, a new city of AI brains. And so we can look at two separate build-outs, data center build-outs that are happening right now to kind of get a feel for this. So the first one is the new Colossus 2 data center from XAI. And so here's a map of where that new data center is going to be. Yes, there are concerns, but this is more just like a good map of the situation. So you can see Memphis up here, and that's a city. That's an existing city. And then here you can see, here's the existing XAI, and then this new XAI data center expansion site. So this is the new Colossus 2 data center, and they're pretty much the same. Memphis has about 1 million people. This new data center, XAI data center, has about 1 million H100s in it. It technically has like 500,000 GB200s, which are like 2x an H100, but it's roughly the same. 1 million people, 1 million chips, and the amount of energy pull is roughly the same. The average person in Memphis spends about 1 kilowatt of electricity, and the average H100 spends about 1 kilowatt of electricity. And so all things considered, it's a gigawatt for Memphis, and it's also a gigawatt for this new data center. The main difference between the two things here, besides, that they're robots and we're not, is Memphis takes up 300 square miles of space. So it's a really big place, while the new XAI data center, Colossus 2, it exists in 1 square mile. And so it's kind of like our human move from rural to urban places, where we got into these cities and almost 100x our density. That's similar, where we're again 100xing the density, where we're shoving tons of brains into this one little square mile. OpenAI's new Stargate Center is another similar thing, where it's going to be in Abilene, Texas. Here's the new Stargate project happening up here. And the Stargate project is roughly the same size as the Colossus project, 1 gigawatt, 1 million H100s, 1 million new brains. And Abilene is roughly 10x smaller. So this is more like a town of 100,000 people, while this new Stargate project is 10x bigger, 10x more brains, 10x more energy draw. So it'll have 1 gigawatt of draw, while Abilene's has like 100 megawatts of draw. Okay, so we're starting to understand these new AI studio apartments and AI cities full of all these new brains. And that kind of begs the question, how many of these AI cities are there? How many brains are there? Are we being taken over by the robots? And so now we can tackle the third piece of this puzzle to really understand the brain power expansion, which is looking at the Homo sapien brain power expansion tens of thousands of years ago versus this new AI expansion today. Okay, so 200,000 years ago, sapiens started to emerge in Africa. There may be 100,000 of us then. And then over time, we started to outcompete the other Homo populations. It was a little Middle Earth time. And we started to kill the other Homo populations like Neanderthals. Okay, so there started to be about 1 million of us, 70,000-ish years ago. We started to do a language. We started to beat all the other people. And by 10,000 years ago, we had spread across the entire world. There were roughly about 10 million of us 10,000 years ago before the agricultural revolution. And so if each of these, cute little red things represents 1 million people, the crazy thing at this time is that it was 5 million people-ish in the Americas and then 5 million people-ish in Africa and Eurasia over here. And so, this was 10 million people at the time. And then as we know, 10,000 years ago, the human population, we got the agricultural revolution. That happened for, thousands and thousands of years. We went up to 10 million, 100 million. And then we got to like 1 billion people in 1800, right before the Industrial Revolution. And then we went from 1 billion to almost 10 billion people now today. Okay, so now that we've poured all these new humans onto the world, all this new brain power, there's 10 billion of us. Each of these represents 1 billion. And instead of being half in the Americas, half here, there's just 1 billion people in the Americas, 1 billion people in Europe, 1 billion people in Africa, and then 5 billion people in Eurasia. And so that's humanity today, is these 8 billion people here. And then by 2100, we're going to get 2 billion more people, and they're all going to be in Africa. So Africa will have 3 billion people soon. So that's what's happened with humans. We've gone from 10 million people to 10 billion people, and each of those people has a little brain going at 1 petaflop. Overall, we spend 20 terawatts of electricity together, about a fifth as much as the whole biosphere. And we can ask a similar question now where we say, well, what's going to happen with AI? So here's a graph that shows operating and planned AI data centers in just the United States. And you can see that this doesn't even include the new 1 gigawatt centers that are happening in Texas. And if you add up all the data centers, you get roughly 10 gigawatts of data centers, or about 10 million people, 10 million little AI people in the world. So this is kind of similar to humans before the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, where there were 10 million of us. There's 10 million new AI chips and GPUs out there in the world, but the difference is that instead of being half in America, half in Eurasia, about 7 out of every 10 are in, 7 million-ish of them are in the United States. There's about 1 million in Europe, and then 1 million in Asia, and then 1 million in China / the Middle East. And so this is the population distribution of these 10 million AI brains today. And so there are about 1,000 times less of them than there are of us in terms of brain power. They also use about 1,000 times less energy than us. They use about 10 gigawatts of energy compared to our, 10 terawatts or 20 terawatts of energy. I do also want to say that in addition to the GPUs out there in the world, the 10 million GPUs, there's about 10 billion CPUs out there in the world, because each little human has a smartphone in our pocket, and that has CPUs in it. The difference is that the smartphones in our pocket are about 1,000 times dumber than a GPU. And so there's 10 million H100s out there in the world that are as smart as us, same amount of petaflops, and there's about the same amount of CPUs as us in the world, but they're 1,000x dumber. And so it's a reasonable question when you look at this and you say, okay, we're just at the start of this new AI brain power explosion. What's going to happen in the next 30 or so years? Well, the answer to that, of course, is Moore's Law, or rather Huang's Law. So here's an image of Moore's Law versus Huang's Law. Moore's Law is for CPUs, while Huang's Law, named after Jensen Huang, is for GPUs. And so here's Moore's Law doubling at 1.5x per year, like 2x every 2 years. And it's starting to level out. This is versus GPU computing, which is going at roughly Moore's Law style rates, maybe even faster. And so what you get is about 1,000x in 10 years. Okay, so if we're going 1,000x every 10 years, what does that mean for our little map? It means that our 10 million-ish GPUs, each of which is just 1 petaflop, that might increase from, effective population size of 10 million, it might go up 1,000x to an effective population size of 10 billion, aka the same as us. I don't actually think that we're going to go from 10 million H100 equivalents to 10 billion H100 equivalents in the next 10 years. But almost certainly, this current bubble that's happening, what's really going on is just like humans expanded our brain power and covered the globe 10,000 years ago, so too are these AI, data centers and these new AI brains starting to cover the globe. And right now they're about 1,000x less than us, but they're getting smarter a lot faster, and they're also starting to pull more and more energy out of the grid. So when I think about the next century, yeah, it'll feel like, our existing, 10 billion humans out here with this new scattering of, AI brain power, and then we're going to get more and more AI brain power over time until we exist in this world that's this weird new symbiotic AI human brain power situation. There are lots of barriers to that, and one of them is energy. If we 1000x the energy going to AI brain power without increasing its efficiency at all, then it would also be pulling 20 terawatts of energy, which is just not going to happen. And the funny thing is that these little AI brains are still very inefficient. It's a kilowatt to run an H100 versus only 20 watts to run a human brain. So that's like 50x more energy efficient. It's going to both pull more energy from the grid, not just 10 gigawatts or 20 gigawatts, but 100 gigawatts. And it's going to get a lot more energy efficient, where hopefully the new AI brains and like the Z100 of the future will just use 20 watts more like a human brain instead of a kilowatt. So is this an AI bubble? A PE ratio would say not really. And an infrastructure build out perspective would say, yeah, we're just building this new infrastructure for the world. And fundamentally, we're pouring new brain power onto everything. And that's our future world that we'll be living in. Thank you, as always, for watching. And thank you to Roots donors for supporting this channel. If you want to understand more about the past and how we got here, check out the previous videos here. And if you want to understand the future and where we're going, feel free to subscribe here. Hope to see you then. Bye.